As a historian, one of the big questions that comes up is, what is the status of Taiwan? What is its historical position? There's a very commonly heard narrative that comes out of China and has been coming out of China for a long time, that Taiwan is an integral part of China's historic territory and that reunification is inevitable. Xi Jinping says this repeatedly. And as a historian, my interest is, well, what is the real case with Taiwan's past? What is Taiwan's position in the world? And I think that to really answer that question, this question of what is Taiwan's position, we have to look back to the past, and we have to look at the people who live in Taiwan and think about who they are, the different groups that live there, and how they came to be in Taiwan and how their identities formed over time. My main expertise is on the period from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, a period of time in which Taiwan was first ruled by China's Qing dynasty, it then became a colony of Japan, and then after World War II, it fell under the governance of the Republic of China. And really what I focus on, however, in my research is social history, looking at the population of Taiwan, the peoples who live there, and how their identities formed in this period of transition. In my research, when I focus on social history, I did a dissertation actually on the social history of a particular city in Taiwan, the city of Gilong, or Gilong, to use the Mandarin pronunciation. It's a port city just to the northeast of Taipei. And this is a city that was very thinly populated. It was an area that was very thinly populated in the late 19th century. It became rapidly one of Taiwan's biggest cities by the 1920s, and the most important port city. And when I look at the social history of that city, I've focused on individuals who were really fundamental to shaping the social structure. I look at religious institutions and practices, and I look at organizations that were formed by these social leaders and practices of social welfare that they implemented. And so that's how I examine the formation of a society and the formation of Taiwanese ethnic identity. The basic finding that I came up with as I was looking at the social history of this city of Gilong was that this population that could trace its ancestry to Southeast China coast, people who had moved over to Taiwan before 1895, under the period of Japanese rule, as they interacted with Japanese settlers and the Japanese colonial state, they created a new identity. They began to think of themselves as Taiwanese, and in an ethnic sense, right? They thought of themselves as a group that was bound by culture, by historical experience, and by a concern with their mutual preservation. They were not primarily concerned with creating a new nation state. I think if I could begin actually in contemporary Taiwan, I think that any visitor to Taiwan today would notice pretty quickly that there are a lot of temples. And if they spend more than a few days in a major city, they'll also notice there are pretty frequent noisy religious celebrations. So religious experience is a pretty common feature of Taiwan's social life today. And one of the findings of my research was that this became especially closely associated with Taiwanese identity during the Japanese period. One of the policies of Japanese colonial rule was, in the 1930s in particular, to try and contain, if you will, Taiwanese religious expression, or the religious expression of the people living in Taiwan. That effort to contain it and to convert people to Japanese Buddhism or to Shinto really caused people to defend their religious practices. If I can pick one small example or one annual festival, there's a major festival called the Ghost Festival that happens every year in the summer months, August or September, follows the lunar calendar, of course. This is a festival that is particularly important in the city of Gilong. It became a real central feature of social activity in the city, and it became a real focus for the formation of this Taiwanese ethnic identity. I think that when we look at religion in Taiwan, it is really important to think about it just as popular religion, as the things that people do and believe. It does pull from Buddhism, it does pull from Taoism, it pulls from the worship of a lot of different deities historically, but it's just a popular religion. It's not easily definable by one tradition. One of the ways in which it became political was certainly during the Japanese period. Again, when there were efforts to stamp out some of these practices and to close down local temples in the 1930s and 40s, one of the ways to resist Japanese colonial rule was to preserve some of these practices and to maintain the temples themselves, to consolidate them perhaps, but to make sure that the temples continued to exist. And then after 1945, when the KMT, the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, came to Taiwan, they also tried to reform local religion. They also viewed the popular religion in Taiwan as maybe superstitious, as not fully modern. And so the KMT regime again tried to modify practices, and that once again made it a political issue. For example, in the early 1950s, there was a strong effort once again to reform this ghost festival in particular, and it became an even stronger part of local identity. When we look at how identities are formed, they're very often formed in contrast to something else. So an effort to control something that is important to a group of people makes them try to defend that element much more strongly. And that is, I think, how religion has become such a central feature of social life in Taiwan today. When I look at Taiwan now, I certainly, as I mentioned, do see a lot of this religious activity, so that's clearly a central feature of contemporary identity, and I think it's also a way in which Taiwanese today differentiate themselves from China, and that's really the central issue here, right? How is Taiwan differentiated from China? The key issue for Taiwanese in differentiating themselves from China today is really showing that this is not a new development, that this in fact has a very long and strong historical foundation. China's narrative, again, is that Taiwan is an integral part of China's historic territory, and that reunification is inevitable. I think part of the objective, I think, for Taiwanese people today and for the assertion of Taiwanese identity today is to show that there are problems with China's narrative, and that reunification wouldn't be the right term. It would be a new development in many ways. The first thing I would say, and not to be self-serving, but I would certainly want to see people read more history. And that's not because I'm trying to sell my book in any way, shape, or form. It's more because I think it's really important for people, policymakers in the United States, in Taiwan, to challenge this narrative that comes out of China and other countries as well. And it's also important for citizens to know what the real history is. There is certainly historical grounding for the Chinese narrative, absolutely. I wouldn't discount that entirely. But there are other narratives out there, and there are other historical bits of historical evidence that suggest that the Chinese narrative is not the only one or an entirely correct one. So what I'd like to see is people learning more of this history, getting a better sense of who the Taiwanese are and how they see their position in the world, and also how that identity took shape over a very long period of time. Part of my personal involvement in this issue just comes from having spent a lot of time in Taiwan over the last 20 or 30 years and developed a very strong attachment to the place. I've obviously got a number of good friends there. I always find myself in a much more relaxed mood when I'm in Taiwan, which might sound strange to people who only think of Taiwan as this place that is always being threatened and missiles are being fired around it, planes are flying over it. I always feel calm when I'm in Taiwan, and I always feel comfortable, as though I'm in a good place. So that's part of my personal skin in the game, as you put it. I also am very interested in seeing conflict being avoided. I think that if there is a conflict around Taiwan, it's going to escalate rather dramatically. And I think that one of the ways in avoiding that conflict in the first place is to better understand what Taiwan is, what Taiwan's history is, and what Taiwanese identity is.